from the blackest corners of your mind, they call, pulling you deep into shadow, twisting your senses, keeping you from sleep. It's time to face your darkest fears. This is Tales to Terrify. Good evening, children of the night, and welcome. Before we get to our fiction, I just wanted to extend some gratitude to those of you who have reviewed the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or wherever you listen. It's a huge help to us and really is one of the simplest ways to support the show. If you haven't already, please consider giving us a rating, or better yet, a review. It helps keep us on the radar for those in search of new dark tales to listen to. And it may even net you a shout-out on the show. Plus, we'd just love to hear from you. Speaking of shout-outs on the show, a huge thank you to our two newest patrons, Tim Tweed and Shay Kersey. It's the support of nefarious fans such as you, Tim and Shay, that keeps the lifeblood flowing through the veins of this infernal beast. We and our monstrous eldritch overlords truly can't thank you enough. Speaking of ancient eldritch entities, our story this evening comes to us from Adam Newnham. Adam lives in the UK with his wife and a toddler he is fairly sure was conceived when certain stars were aligned, and whose birth coincided with vivid nightmares amongst the world's psychically sensitive. He doesn't write as much as he'd like, but has had stories published by Hereth Publishing, Scare Street, Lovecraftiana, and Dark Recess Press. Children of the Night, join me for Adam Newnham's The Munitionette, a Tales to Terrify original.
It was not patriotic fervour that had driven Annie Warren to Kingsport Royal Ordnance Factory, but rather the awkward guilt of the wealthy. She had been living in comfort with her mother and father-in-law in the country, far away from the falling bombs and the most stringent rationing, and she hadn't needed to work on the assembly lines that poured an endless stream of shells, landmines, grenades and bullets into the war effort's insatiable gullet. But how could she sit in idle comfort when Arthur was away risking his life in unthinkable conditions for a future free from Nazi tyranny? How would she be able to meet her husband's eye when he came home, war-scarred and weary, if she was fresh and clean and fat with ease? And just as it was guilt that had moved her to become a munitionette, as the public had dubbed the mostly female workers that staffed the munition factories, so it was shame that drove her legs, as she ran towards Workshop 8, 10 minutes late for shift, Rose giggling beside her. Going out dancing the night before had been Rose's idea, of course. It was always Rose's idea, and Annie never seemed able to say no. Annie had never met anyone like Rose. When she arrived at the bunk she'd been assigned at the factory dormitories, mute and awkward amongst the cliques of workers who had been there for months, Rose swept her up in a hurricane of bad language and unaccustomed tactility. Annie's own background was the sort of rural gentility which encouraged reserve and decorum, and the onslaught of familiarity had left her breathless. Rose's husband, Will, was also away, stationed in North Africa, whilst Annie was consumed with worry, imagining 1,000 different ghastly scenarios for her husband every day. Rose would unashamedly seek out the American troops that drank and gambled in nearby Kingsport town to divert herself. It wasn't long before Rose had pulled Annie into her world of illicit social escapades and the drinking and revelry it entailed. Annie found herself drawn to the novelty of Rose's reckless passions, like some entranced woodland creature might be to the headlights of a car. They slipped inside the workshop and took their stations without being spotted by the stewards. Annie cinched her scarf around her head, determined to make up the lost time, and got to work filling shell cases with TNT. Halfway through her 12-hour shift, the factory din had pushed her headache past pain into a dull numbness, and she even found herself able to laugh at Rose, who teased the few men on the line with her flirting terribly. It was just as Annie's conscience and hangover had started to ease that she slipped, tipped the bucket of hot TNT she was carrying over her lap, and breaking her ankle in the process. Annie was moved down to the infirmary whilst the mild burns and broken ankle healed, the small ward's only patient. It was a mile from the factory, and she felt a guilty relief at her distance from the site. Ever since she had arrived, the grounds of the factory complex had felt strange to her, an oddness that was more than just unfamiliarity. Like most of the workers that lived on site, she was plagued with strange dreams, and would wake at night to the sound of distant singing, maddeningly just beyond full hearing. There was a forced jocularity to much of the conversation between the workers, as if they were keeping at bay some latent dread, and to speak of the inarticulate oddities of the place would somehow risk manifesting them. Her sense of relief at being free of this atmosphere was marred by the fact that she had not had a letter from Arthur in 3 weeks. Despite the regimental liaison telling her over the phone that they had had no report suggesting he had come to harm, Annie began to dread the sound of approaching footsteps, certain that it would be someone come to tell her the worst. On her 5th night in the infirmary, she woke from a fitful sleep in the darkness of the small ward to hear the slow rasping breaths of another patient. Annie saw that one of the bed spaces had been curtained off. She tried to go back to sleep, but before long a low muttering sounded from behind the curtain. Annie limped down on her crutches towards the bed. "Hello?" she said. The muttering stopped. Annie waited a few seconds, skin prickling in the gloom. She was about to go back to her bed when the muttering started again. She edged closer, straining to hear. "They did this to us, changed us. Shouldn't have to, not to win the war, not for anything. No point now, what's it all for? Won't be nothing left, nothing worth saving at least. And how can she look at me now? How can she love this? Nothing can love what will be left, nothing to love anyway, nothing left but the great black and them." The voice was a wet, rasping whisper. Annie smelled rotten fish and a rank sweetness. She edged forward, reaching a hand towards the curtain. "What do you think you're doing?" Annie whirled. A man in a suit stood appraising her severely. Annie recognised Mr. Carrillo, the factory manager, from his welcome speech during Annie's induction. "Hello, sir, I was just—" "Warren, isn't it?" "Yes, I read about your accident in the morning bulletin. I was most surprised to see your name on the enrolments lists, you know. I knew your father-in-law. Good man. Good stock. I would have thought better of someone of your background than to be snooping around gawking at a poor injured soldier. That's the behaviour I'd expect from the slack-jawed sheep you have chosen to associate with." "Excuse me?" Annie said, taken aback at the unprovoked hostility. "Nurse, have this patient transferred to the assessment room," Carrillo said, cocking his head towards Annie. A cowed-looking nurse strode past the man and ushered Annie, too stunned to resist, out into the corridor. As she left, she chanced to glance back at the other bed and saw a single hand slip through the curtain. In the shadowy half-light of the bay, the fingers of the hand looked like the bulb-tipped mottled digits of some monstrous toad. Annie spent 2 weeks in the infirmary, finding the new patient gone when she returned to the ward the morning after her eviction. She had still not heard from Arthur by the time she was discharged. Though her ankle was still sore and her healing skin a raw pink, she was assessed fit to work and bussed back to the factory. She was reassigned to Workshop 8, but Rose was absent, presumably working in another shop that day. After a grueling shift, the bell rang for changeover, and Annie trudged back to her bunk. Before she reached her dormitory, Rose glided up behind her and took her by the arm, wordlessly leading her into a shadowed alley between two storehouses. "Hello, Annie." Rose was pale and sunken-eyed, as if she hadn't slept for days. "Well, I knew you'd miss me, but honestly, you look quite awful. Have you been pining so badly?" Rose's answering smile was hollow. "Annie, I did something stupid." "What else is new?" "Not like that," Rose said, shaking her head in irritation. Annie had never seen Rose like this. There was always a playfulness to her words, and its absence now was unnerving. "Will owed money," Rose went on quickly. "A lot of money, to some bad men. I thought, with the bloody war on, they'd leave it be. But I suppose men like that don't leave matters alone when there's money involved. They found me in town one night, not long after your little slip. Said they were going to hurt me when I told them I couldn't pay." "Rose, slow down. Listen, they offered me a choice, said there was another way I could square Will's debts. Told me, if I wanted Will to recognise me when he gets back, I'd have to do something for some of their friends." "Do what?" Rose hesitated for a second, before answering. "Shop 12. Said that to go inside, take some photos for them. They gave me a camera, give them the film, and that'd be that." "Please, tell me you didn't." "Will likes the way I look. So do I, as it happens," she added with a small, rueful smile. "So next day after shift, I walked to 12 with this little camera stitched into my overalls. I slipped in with the night shift." "My God, they could have you arrested as a spy." "Oh, Christ, maybe I am. But that ain't the worst of it, not by half." Rose stopped again, and Annie saw the spectre of some clinging horror flit across her face. "What I saw in 12, the things they're making, I couldn't even guess. The fumes were disgusting. The machines weren't like none of the ones I've seen in the other shops. There was stuff there they were ferrying around, like meat, from no animal I ever seen. And the girls, I'd kept my head down going in, but when I looked, I saw some of the girls on the line and their skin was green, I swear, and their eyes black as a sinner's soul. None of them said a fucking word, Annie. Just walked around like they were all sleepwalking or something." As Annie listened, she felt some crucial piece of her life scaffolding being undermined, rusting and warping with every word Rose said. Suddenly, she wanted nothing more than to leave this shadowed alley and forget everything she'd just heard. "I took a few photos. Nothing like how much they wanted, but I was too scared to hang about. Then I stowed myself in an empty cart and got wheeled out. Thought I got away with it." Shadows danced in the narrow space, and Rose flinched. A magpie landed, cocked its head at the pair, and flew away. "I went to meet the men to give over the camera. Waited hours, but they never showed. I chucked it in a pond, wanted shot of the whole business, but on the way back I had this feeling, like I was being watched. I have that feeling all the time now. I'm scared, Annie." Annie had nothing to say, no spare energy to add this to her own anxieties. A silence stretched out between them. "I need money." "What?" "Something's going to happen to me. I know it. I shouldn't have seen what I did. They're building stuff in there that's got no earthly right to be built. And what kind of people do something like that? I've got to leave. I thought we could go somewhere." Annie took a step back. "What do you mean, we?" "Well, I'm skint, Annie. I know you've got a bit, and trust me, I don't want to be here anymore. This ain't what we thought. I've been thinking, a lot. If what I saw in the shop is anything to go by, I don't think we know the real way of things. What this war's about, what is happening out there where our boys are. This place is wrong, Annie. Everyone knows it, but no one else says it. No. Annie, please, I need your help." Annie steeled herself. This wasn't a clandestine jaunt to town. This was desertion. This was treason. "I said no, and I don't ever want to talk about this again. I won't report you, but if anyone asks me what you said, I'll tell them. Every word, Rose. I swear to God Almighty, I won't risk my future for someone—" Annie stopped herself, but the words seemed to sound in the quiet nonetheless. "Someone like me," Rose finished for her, sneering. "Well, pardon me, Lady fucking Muck. I thought we were mates." She looked Annie up and down before turning away, leaving her shivering in the growing cold. Annie waited a long while for Rose to outdistance her, not wanting another encounter, and when she reluctantly returned to their bunk, she found that Rose had been reassigned to another space. "You just missed her," one of the other women informed Annie, who told herself it was just coincidence, that Rose was fine, and that anyway, she was better off without her. After Rose's story and Arthur's enduring silence, Annie spent the next 2 weeks in a nerve-wracked trance. She hadn't seen her friend since their exchange in the alley, and to her annoyance, Annie found herself growing increasingly worried for her, as well as guilty about the way she had handled things. Still, Annie had been raised with the stoic insularity of her class, and she might have put her cares aside and go on much as she had the last 6 months, if she had not seen the green-skinned woman. She joined Annie's line one morning without a word of greeting, silent and emotionless and grimly automatic, little different than one of the machines. Her skin was flushed green, not the common yellow that arose from exposure to the sulfur used in explosives. Rose's description of Shop 12 came back to her in all its detail. Something did feel wrong about this place, just as Rose had said. Why had she not listened, instead of closing her eyes and ears like a child? And Annie could no longer deny that she missed Rose, her bawdy humour, her cheer, her resilience against the unseen horror of war and the shadow it cast over the country. Had she not realised how precious her raw life force was, how being close to Rose was like being close to a campfire in a darkening forest? Without that warmth, the cold had stolen up on her with sudden bitterness. A shift change. Annie headed out to search for Rose. The workers she spoke with were subdued, and none had seen Rose for days. Annie walked back to her bunk. The mystery of her husband's silence, and now Rose's absence, pressed down on her with dumb, irresistible weight, and she was suddenly viscerally sick of not knowing. Before she could talk herself out of it, Annie had clambered over the side of a cart standing on the rails leading into Shop 12. Annie crouched down in the shadows of the empty cart, hoping her resolve would hold. Half an hour passed before another cart thudded into hers, and she was propelled forward, through the creaking freight door of the shop. The stench hit her, immediate and breathtaking, the sweet rotten fish smell she recognised from the infirmary. She came to rest amidst a clatter of machinery and tentatively raised her head above the cart's rim. The floor was crowded with unfamiliar machines, metallic surfaces iridescent under the weak lighting. Workers pumped the handles of cylindrical devices that spat out glistening, irregular shapes, which were carefully loaded into carts and wheeled away. Chutes, leathery and veined like vast avian cloacae, hung from shadowy overhead gantries and spat globs of matter onto a conveyor that the workers, skin a shocking ebony green, lifted and placed inside what Annie guessed were shell casings, though spirally configured in a fashion she had never seen. In the centre of the shop was a vast mass of rainbow-hued tissue, milled around by workers with huge cleavers who would hack lumps from the mass before carrying the strange meat through a doorway, cradling it as reverently as a mother with her infant. Annie cursed, fighting to control her panic. What had she hoped to achieve coming here? It seemed an insane, impulsive course of action now, and if Rose was even here, there was no way she could search for her without being discovered herself. All Annie wanted now was to get out. She climbed from the cart and saw that she was on the periphery of the assembly shop. She began skirting the perimeter looking for an exit. "Miss," Annie heard someone call, the rough authority of the voice announcing the speaker as a guard. She quickened her pace, not turning around. "You, hold it," the guard called out, louder. A door lay ahead of her. She pushed it open and slipped inside. The room beyond was empty, gas masks and rubber aprons hanging on either wall. There was a heavy metal door on the far side, but Annie found it locked. She cast around the room and saw a bunch of keys clipped to one of the aprons. She fumbled the bunch free and took it to the locked door. The third key she tried slipped into the recess just as the door through which she'd entered opened. The guard stepped into the room and levelled a submachine gun at her. "Oh, sweetness, let's stop there." Annie had never had a gun pointed at her. She almost froze, but some clear-minded part of her knew with the certainty of instinct that she had seen too much, that the people responsible for the things in this place were not people who would abide her transgression. She had seen something that waited behind the veil, a glimpse of some dark and appalling truth. There would be a price to pay. If she made it outside, Annie doubted the guard would be able to identify her amongst the other workers. She ducked quickly around the unlocked door and pulled it shut, locking it from the inside. A concussive tattoo beat against the door, its metal bulging out like the caps of some deadly mushroom. My God, he tried to... There was no doubting the stakes now. Annie ran down a flight of metallic stairs, flanked by thick meshing through which naked earth could be seen. Amber lamps cast a weak light. There was no other direction to go, so she ran on, deeper and deeper, trembling and doused in sweat, until she reached the grating of a large freight lift. She drew aside the grate and stepped inside, hoping that it would take her back to the surface and an unguarded exit. To her dismay, the lift rattled into life, and she found herself descending. The lift jerked to a halt a full minute later, Annie trembling under the light cast by a small bulb. She pulled aside the grating and stared out onto a narrow walkway, lit only by light from the lift interior. She stepped out onto the walkway and the lift shuddered back into life, ascending into the shadows, leaving a pall of darkness around her. Annie stood, shaking and blind on the walkway. She could sense a vast emptiness around her, currents of cold air swirling about some cavernous void. She inched forward, hand gripped tight around the guide rail. Her eyes slowly adjusted, and she saw with relief that the darkness was not absolute. A diffuse glow materialized ahead of her. As she neared the light, a structure resolved from the shadows. A wide dome, summit lost in the darkness above her. The glow came from some substance that veined the dome's outer structure, phosphorescing gently. The walkway passed through a small opening into the dome. Annie paled at the thought of entering it. It seemed like the nest of some immense subterranean insect, a thing never meant for the surface, fit only for the blind, squirming realms of Earth's lightless innards. But where else was there to go? Hysteria scratched at the edges of her mind. If she stayed in the darkness, she would panic. Perhaps there was a way out ahead. Seeing no alternative, Annie stepped inside. Within the dome, the darkness was total. She could hear bubbling liquid and what sounded like wheezing, laboured breathing. "Is someone there?" Annie said, wincing at how loud her voice sounded in the darkness. "Annie? Rose, my God, where are you?" "Help me," Rose said, and Annie began groping around the wall, unable to trace Rose's voice in the echoing space. The wall's surface was irregular, soft and yielding, covered in places with a jellied dampness. "What is this? Where are you?" Annie called. "Here," Rose said. "Here," another voice, fainter than Rose's. "Help me," said a third. More voices sounded in the darkness, and Annie backed away from the walls, turning to face each disembodied cry, wheeling around in a terror that grew vertiginously amidst the plaintive, desperate cacophony. "Annie!" Rose called above the noise. She sounded closer now, and Annie headed to where she thought Rose was. Arms outstretched before her, she shuffled forward until she at last found Rose, who was apparently secured against the wall. The soft outline of her flesh interrupted by baffling extrusions and restraints. "What is this?" "My pocket," Rose said. After a second's confusion, Annie delved into the damp folds of tattered cloth that constituted Rose's clothing, finding the Zippo lighter Rose had once been given by an American GI. Hands slick, Annie was only able to coax one brief, fleeting flame from the lighter before it guttered and died. It was enough. Rose wasn't Rose anymore. The cherubic fullness of her face had become waxen and cadaverous. Her cheekbones jutted forth so sharply Annie feared they might cut through her skin. Tubes attached to the matter of the dome buried into her flesh like obscene umbilici, and liquids pulsed to and from her enmeshed form in a chorus of repulsive aspiration. She looked at Annie, eyes black with madness. "My God, what have they done to you?" Annie breathed. "Get them out." Annie hesitated only briefly before she groped about and found one of the cannulas plumbed into Rose's shoulder. Rose whimpered but urged Annie on, and with worrying ease Annie pulled the tube free from her body. A sonorous droning sounded from somewhere below their feet, rumbling up through the floor of the structure. Something beneath them was moving. "Poking around where you're not welcome again, I see." A voice sounded above her. Annie flinched, recognizing the voice of Mr. Carrillo. She looked up but could see nothing in the darkness. She had the manic, fleeting epiphany that this was always the way of things, being watched by invisible men in the shadows of a world that was dark and violent for reasons she had never understood. "What have you done to her?" "Made her part of the war effort, the greatest endeavour our once proud empire has ever undertaken. You have no idea how close we came to losing this war. In the early months, some would have had us bow to the Axis, beg mercy from the Thule Society and their bastard sorcerers, saying we could never defeat their profane alliances. But, whilst King George draws breath, this nation will never surrender. We sought alliances of our own, where the enemy looked out into the vast black abyss for their new confederates. We turned to the sleeping powers that held sway on this world eons before man was conceived by evolution's mindless fumbling." I don't understand," Annie called out into the shadows. "So what? Do you always know what you make in the workshops? Do you understand the interplays of physics and chemistry at work when a shell you have made shreds a man to mulch? No. But you obey." "Don't stop," Rose whispered. "They're drinking me. Underneath us, so many, so many." "Yes, so many indeed," Carrillo said. "We have woken them, and even in their first stirrings they give us the secrets of their terrible science, give us a chance to win this war. But our new masters have slept long, and they have grown so very hungry." "Please," Rose said. Through the madness that had suddenly become her reality, Annie reasoned that she could be shot at any point. If she was going to die, she would at least die freeing Rose from this nightmare. She pulled another tube from the wasted muscle of Rose's abdomen, and the floor trembled with the motion of whatever shifted and roiled beneath them. "I don't want to waste you, Anne Warren," Carrillo said. "You are from good blood. It's decent English stock like yours we want for the coming age. Loyal stock, that knows the value of country, that respects the fact people are born into their proper place in life. So, I offer you a choice. You can free your friend and reap the harvest of your treason, or you can simply stop, go back to work, and, when the Nazi hordes have been laid waste and their blasphemous allies repelled, you will see your husband again." Annie stopped. Her hand, covered in the ichor of the foul instrument she was pulling from Rose, hovered in the darkness. "Captain Arthur Warren," the man said. "A patriot, a true hero of the new order. He fights for you, having willingly accepted our master's gifts. Would you reject his sacrifice?" Annie watched a light grow off to her left, faintly illuminating a second opening in the wall. A stairway lay beyond it. All the long months of imagined happiness, her fantasies and plans and bitter longing, loomed huge in her mind. Arthur was alive. She knew it was true, knew it in her bones. He was fighting for her. She couldn't throw that away, couldn't betray him like that. Not for Rose, not for anyone. "I'm sorry," Annie whispered, and she edged back, away from Rose. "Annie, no! Help us!" The others started up again. "Free us! Kill us!" Annie turned, tears thick on her cheeks. She walked away from Rose, through the wailing and torments of that small nighted hell, towards the light. Had it only been a year since she last saw him? It seemed like so much longer. Annie was riven by nervous energy. She had dusted the house 1,000 times, swept the pathway through their neat front garden to their freshly painted door, cleaned the windows, washed the linen. She had even decorated their nursery, hopeful in its pastel shades. She had reinscribed the sigils and left fresh offerings on the supplication stone outside the house. A rabbit and a squirrel, caught and flensed this morning, and had dressed in an outfit that was suitably formal for the occasion, yet showed off her figure. Makeup didn't take to her skin anymore, but she knew Arthur wouldn't care. He would be changed too, she understood, on the outside at least, but what was important was inside, their true aspects, the selves that loved each other and had endured things beyond imagining, just for this day. The headaches were still a problem, but they were getting easier to bear. The whispering that came to her at night was less violating now, was almost intelligible. The strangeness of the night sky that had caused so much trouble was easily avoided. You simply didn't look at it. And when things came in the night to her quiet street, when they snuffed and probed the perimeter of the house, the offerings were always fresh enough, the sigils clear enough, that she was left mostly unmolested. The war effort was winding down after the armistice. Many of the demobbed munitionettes had been reassigned as oblation and bussed off to new hives, but the ministry wouldn't send her away. Not with Arthur being commended for valour on the field of battle, and Annie's displays of loyalty over the past months. They would be well placed in society now. It was everything she had ever wanted. As she waited, jittery with tension, for Arthur to arrive, an image of Rose's laughing face came to mind, sharing some scandalous lewdness or other, and Annie had to suppress a smirk. Then the image was replaced, as all her memories of Rose were, by that last sight of her friend, scared and wasted in the darkness. "No, not today. I won't let you spoil it." As if her resolution was an incantation, the crunch of tyres sounded on the gravel outside. A door opened, and then shut. She heard footfalls in a heavy, irregular cadence approaching the house. Annie froze. She couldn't believe this was really happening. Did she want this? To lose the malleable pleasures of her daydreaming? To exchange her fantasies for hard reality? But what is reality now? A voice whispered from some deep and forgotten place, some basement of her mind, whispering through a door locked and barred and straining against the pressure of what lay within. The whisper of another Annie, whose skin was not the oily green of her own, who did not offer tormented animal sacrifices to nameless gods, who was slowly getting louder. Annie shook her head, carefully replacing her hair after a few coils fell loose. What a foolish passing fear, like a bride on her wedding night. Of course this was what she wanted. She smoothed the pleats of her dress as the sound of Arthur shambling along the garden path grew louder, smiled the smile she had been practicing for this very moment, and opened the front door to welcome her husband home.
That was Adam Newnham's The Munitionette, as read by Georgia Cook. Georgia Cook is an illustrator and writer from London. She has experience on both sides of the recording booth, and in addition to Tales to Terrify, has contributed to such podcasts as the other stories, and The Night's End, as both a narrator and writer. She can be found on Twitter at Georgia Cooked and on her website at georgiacookWriter.com. Thank you, Georgia. Well, children of the night, the hour is late and we've run out of tales to tell. For now. Tales to Terrify is made possible by the tremendous generosity of our supporters on Patreon and PayPal. Incredible fans like Lestle Baxter, Amanda Carrillo, Amanda Gottfried, and Orion D. Hegre, whose generous support keeps these lights on and flickering ominously. If you're not a supporter, head over to patreon.com/Tales to Terrify. You'll find all kinds of perks, like ad-free episodes, bonus content, and one-of-a-kind collectibles. Every dollar goes back into this show, and we appreciate your support so much. Want another way to support the show that doesn't cost you a cent? Head over to Podchaser, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts and drop us a 5-star review. You'll not only put an unnaturally wide smile on our faces, but help new listeners discover our terrifying tales too. You can show your love of the show out in the world with some Tales to Terrify merch. TalesToTerrify.com/merch will take you to our TeePublic store, where we've got a great collection of creepy custom and curated designs. Tales to Terrify is produced by Seth Williams, Meredith Morgenstern, Andrew Gibson, Crystal Hammond, Spencer Disparty, and myself, Drew Sebastini, with original theme by Nebulous Entertainment. Tales to Terrify is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Join us again next week as we devour the things we love most with more Tales to Terrify.